So, welcome this afternoon, Donncha. Really pleased to have you on this recording with us, looking at unpacking adaptive reuse and the implications of what it means to various people. So, first of all, let me just introduce you. Donncha O Shea is partner at Gustafson Porter and Bowman. And is working on a range of projects at the moment, including the UK's National Holocaust Memorial and the Landscape Master Plan for Chelsea Barracks in West London. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
First question I'd like to really start with is how do you interpret adaptive reuse? What are the important elements that you sort of draw from the projects that you are involved in?
Well, Alison, I think it was great this year to be able to see the range of what adaptive reuse is when judging the WAN Awards. What was fascinating was that the notion of adaptive reuse often reverts back to an element or a building that just can't be found any other purpose, and maybe it's protected heavily by some sort of legal protection, and therefore people feel the need that they have to make use of that building. But this year, in looking at the entries, and there's a huge range of entries there, it was evident that people are choosing to adaptively reuse buildings, for the value it presents to them, not just in economic terms, but actually in terms of the quality of maybe the fabric of what's there, the story that's behind an element. Most importantly, from my perspective, I think from a sustainable perspective, people realize that to tear something down and start again, that should really, in my perspective, be the last straw. You have tried everything else and there is no other solution available to a development. So, what is adaptive reuse? It's essentially recognizing that maybe time, energy, efforts have gone into bringing physical built element to where it is today. Maybe it's seen better days, but maybe its journey hasn't finished yet. Maybe there is another chapter to its life, and adaptive reuse is exploring and finding what that chapter might be.
Would you say it's a more complicated way of working through architecture? What are some of the challenges that you would see?
Well, yeah, it certainly is. I think, on a really simple level, you could say, well, if I have an existing building and I have to find a new use for it, or I could demolish that and start with its footprint or its ground plane, start again. Your first instinct will be, oh, that would be easier because I wouldn't be constrained by what's there. I think that is easier for some people's mentality, some designers' mentalities, because some designers don't design to constraints. We design to constraints. Our existing constraints are what shape a project. It's very hard for us to ignore what's within a site, what's adjacent to a site. And therefore, anything that's physically part of that informs the design, informs the narrative of the design. So I think it is definitely more difficult because there is probably complexity from a structural point of view, maybe a legal point of view, maybe health and safety, accessibility. These are all challenges, but a good designer can take all these challenges and really feed back a design that is more than the sum of just those parts.
And I guess retrofitting energy systems, bringing the buildings back to life. What is the most difficult challenge of trying to do something like that? Is it the costs that are involved, or actually just utilizing the new technologies into an old structure?
Sure. And I think yeah, you said there the words new technology and old structure. The two things don't naturally go together. It depends on what's trying to be achieved. If it is trying to bring something back to what it was, almost trying to ignore that we're living in a current climate or living in a current sort of situation, that this building has got a new function to it. If you're trying to almost be pastiche, that is very difficult, because you're literally physically trying to make something fit in a space that maybe it wasn't meant to be in. If we saw it in a number of the entries this year, people aren't as precious now about seeing ventilation ducts or seeing sort of power units having to be integrated into spaces that maybe previously wouldn't have had heated or any other elements in it. Recognizing these are part of the modern vocabulary of what needs to be there, and maybe accepting that it is a change in the aesthetic of what something looked like historically, those two things come together and they create a new aesthetic and a new vocabulary. So I think the challenge is there if you're trying to ignore that both something is being brought into the current and yet the needs of our current environment, are trying to be ignored and sort of hidden away behind plenums and that sort of thing. If we can accept that these spaces have to be allowed flex and adapt to a new condition, well then that is the first hurdle having been overcome.
I thought, I guess, embracing the new technology within the new structure and recognizing it for what it is. It's
absolutely. Yeah, and I think if you like, adaptive reuse, if you took it from a purely historicist point of view, which is only one perspective, I think, understanding the Venice Charter says what's new is new, what's old is old. In fact, that for me is a great starting point, because that also sort of unleashes a bit of the creativity, because you can sort of have a dialogue with it, you can bounce off it, you can move beyond it, as long as your intentions are always to sort of utilize that fabric for the benefit of both the building and the users in the building.
Thank you. So everybody in the world has a different approach, I imagine, to adaptive reuse and different restrictions kicking in. What experience would you say of countries that are doing it well, and how are they doing it?
Well, it is difficult because, again, it's down to what is the purpose in adapting and reusing something and reusing an existing building. What are you changing it from and to? If it's a private home, the constraints are far less, because it's down to the comfort level of an individual who has their control over what they may do. If it's for a sort of an office commercial like environment, you suddenly find there's a lot more constraints, because you're trying to set to standards, local building standards, local guidelines that need to be achieved. So it depends what is trying to be achieved. I think if I can sort of maybe twist the question a little bit, which is who's encouraging these things to happen? Who's encouraging there to be adaptive reuse? How is it that some places are more successful than others? And interestingly, we had a lot of entries from China and across Asia this year in the One Awards. And what was very interesting about that is that the sheer scale of development happening in those countries would often make you think there is no moment of pause for adaptive reuse. I'm just going to just keep, not figuratively, bulldozing and building to achieve the levels of development needed. But in fact, when you looked at the solutions being presented, there were solutions that were for small-scale interventions, or for sort of cultural institutions, or for retail elements within a town center. And what was fascinating about that was there was a desire to keep it, and that desire was partially brought in by definitely local laws that were saying we need to protect the disappearing landscape of urban development, but then also the value that people saw in what it created as a new, not a new building, a new structure, because the building had always been there and it could have been demolished and a new building built that satisfied its needs, but the value was considered great enough that it brought another layer into it. So in China, that's really interesting, and usually it's through local laws. I know in Singapore they had to very much put a protection across the sort of the old city center areas, which right now they don't meet any of the needs of living in that sort of climate in Singapore. But there's a value to those spaces that goes maybe beyond the comfort levels of the individuals. So I think in the UK, if we look at what we have here, we have very, very good development protection, and we've also got very good support, I'd say, financially, to encourage buildings to be reused. Probably isn't as strong as it could be. I think there definitely needs to be more emphasis put on not just restoring an element, but finding new uses. And that's the whole point of adaptive reuse. It's finding new uses that maybe that building wasn't originally built for. But ensuring that its fabric and its story that it tells is continued into the future.
And I think you mentioned that we had 3 entries from China amongst many that have made the shortlist. Out of those, what would you say had the biggest challenge within it, the adaptive reuse? As a judge, you saw it going through the process. Which one do you think really achieved what it set out to do, or were they all of equal value?
Well, the ones we're thinking of here, there are 3 quite different developments. So it's very hard to compare like for like. I
Yeah,
think.
so perhaps if we look at the first one, which is by Mad Architects, the Hutong Bubble 218, which is a renovation of 305 square meters traditional Qing Dynasty courtyard house, which has now been renovated and it is back in use again. So how would you sort of talk through that particular project?
Well, what was really interesting with that project was the fact that you could say the value of the initial the fabric of that existing building is very high. You know, the value of that was quite high in terms of it being a remnant of a previous period, and the choice to reuse it was taken, I'd say, not lightly, because it would have been quite a large undertaking to have to protect something of that high value while bringing new function into it. What was quite wonderful about the project by Mad is the playfulness in which they dealt with it, and in a way, referred to the Venice Charter earlier, they sort of took that and they ran with that as much as they could, and they said, how different do you want that new intervention to be? But it wasn't foreign in a strange way, even though the language is different, the materiality is different. It didn't feel out of place, the solution. It just felt like a natural sort of evolution of this building.
Next stage for this building that settled well.
And so it, you know, that the challenge to set a bar quite high that they want to achieve a modern intervention within what is considered quite a high value, probably existing structure. You know, that is setting quite a challenge for yourself. And, you know, if you want constraints, that's a good constraint to start with. When you look at, I think if we refer maybe to the Capsule Hostel.
Hostel and bookstore. Yes, it's in Village Gwinglong Wu, which again is a wooden structure, 232 square meters and mud walls. So that must have been quite a challenge in itself.
Well, exactly. And when you see these images and you're looking at this probably quite traditional looking building, we've definitely just described it there. It's got quite simple materials, incredible in the sense that it's still surviving. And then again, that's the longevity that comes probably with traditional building, that it's more appropriate to its context. But the choice there to keep it, which is a fantastic context in which to keep this building, but then to bring new life into it. It's not trying to be pastiche. It's not trying to be in any way historicist. It brings intervention in when there's intervention needed. It adapts and it ties in almost seamlessly with its context. And I'd say the challenge there, probably more than anything else, was a physical structural challenge. How do you keep this quite, I would say, even though it's quite large and robust looking, probably quite a difficult structure to keep in situ and work around and work through, remove an entire gable end wall, install a new triple height extension. You know, these are not small moves. These are quite brave, quite strong moves that rely on the existing building to be successful. So it's not in any way ignoring, it's not trying to just use the building as a volume. It's actually referring to it. It's drawing itself out from it. It just feels like, again, this natural next step in a building's life with some really nice detailing that sort of makes reference to contemporary language of architecture.
And our final discussion point for this afternoon was the Pocket Plaza, which is in downtown Shanghai. Again, this was a renovation of an old quarter, which they wanted to dismantle the shabby residences as it's described here, but obviously they've reformatted the building and made it work. So what sort of stood out from that for you?
I think for all the judges, when we discussed this particular project, its modesty actually brought it home more than anything else. It's simple in its conception of defining a public space through the use of a pergola and the very simple placement of some trees, fountains, unifying ground plane. But when you consider the context and you consider the pressures that this amount of land must have on it, the fact that it has been retained, improved, and given new life, it made all the judges feel quite positive about decisions that are made when it comes to development. Development can be considered a big dirty word. Of course, we don't think so, because development can be a positive thing. And when we see projects like this, we see the effect of positive decision making on an urban area. And even then, those moves, which were quite straightforward and simple, as I've described. In fact, there's a boldness in the detailing. There's a recognition of place in terms of some of the really nice sort of jointing detail in the timbers. It has its own character. It has its own spatial and placemaking qualities. And on such a small site, to have that level of impact, where that everyone who looked at this had an immediate recognition of the impact this would have had on the lives of the people living around it. We could see that it was definitely worthy of being recognized in the adaptive reuse category.
And I think it's really refreshing to see, as you say, these older areas being renovated, but with the essence of what they were built originally for. Hold that more or less quite romantic view, perhaps, of some of these buildings, and to give them extra strength and extra life to continue on. It's important, I think, to see those stories, isn't it, play out. And this does leave these buildings in a very, very much healthier, stronger position for future generations to see their uses. So to conclude, what would you say was the biggest challenge, really, that you think adaptive reuse is against in this modern era? Is it perhaps the fact that it holds some quite a cachet for people who want to see these buildings reused, actually means that they will be respected going forward? Or are you concerned that perhaps sometimes the developers win over adaptive reuse?
I do think that the argument, if you want to call it that, against reusing something, I think that argument is weighed more heavily by a developer, more successfully by a developer than it should be. I think it's unfortunate, but we see it in the news all the time. We see it in changes in planning laws. The expectation that a developer who is obviously investing time, energy, and money to create something, and their needs and their priorities are the top of the sort of the awarding body, the planning body's priorities, is unfortunate. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but I'm saying that there's a need to give buildings more protection. I'm not talking about historical protection. I mean protection in terms of the value of keeping them. And that protection could come from more investment or support for investment in terms of adapting it, getting it over the actual hurdle of it not just being an artifact, but it being a living space, which comes back to your question earlier about how much of a challenge is it to make it adaptable and usable for today's needs. And developers, no doubt, will use that as an argument against reusing something, because they would suggest it's probably excessive amount of expenditure or investment or energy needed to make this work. But that's because ultimately they have a business to run, and their business needs to ensure that there's profit. If we haven't, as a sort of general public, said we place a higher value on a building that existed and will continue to exist over a new building, then nobody else is going to put that same value on it. And I think that's where there's a slight problem going forward. Are buildings being kept as artifacts, or are buildings being kept as usable living sort of volumes for new uses and new people to enjoy? And I think until we understand why we're keeping buildings properly and what support's needed for those buildings, it'll always slip between these two different categories. So that obviously, if it is so historically important, it will be kept, but then it may not be used. And the challenges that I would imagine are the ideas of universal design and accessibility. It's very hard in old buildings to make them as accessible to current standards. Not to say it's impossible, but it would definitely mean there's aspects of that building that are not able to be enjoyed by everybody. Is that acceptable? Is there some other way that building can be used? That's the question. But then from a sustainable point of view, ultimately, it has to be more practical to keep a building that has had time, energy, and resources go into it, has been enjoyed, every day of its existence, and deserves to be continued. And that that needs to be made as a value that everybody appreciates. And I think that's the challenge. You know, the general public maybe don't see beyond what is a National Trust-like property. They don't see that a building that was a row of terraced houses has a value to continue some sort of usage going into the future. It's not that we have to necessarily educate people about that, but we definitely need to fight for those buildings to be seen to be used more, so that people recognize that it's both possible and it's worthwhile doing it.
And to celebrate these buildings for what they are, the value that they give to society, and will continue to do so. So thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and a great insight into those three entries. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alison.